Welcome back to the Fresh Expressions podcast. I am Heather Delott, and I am here with my friend Gannon Sims. Hey, Gannon.
Hey, Heather. It's great to be with you today.
It is great to be with you as well. We have a great conversation that you had with our director of Fresh Expressions North America, Dr. Christopher Backert, in regards to really the future of the church and specifically denominational leaders and how they can be agents of change and really catalyze a missional movement within these denominations. What really kind of struck you from your conversation with Chris Gannon?
I think what struck me is that Chris is a student of denominations of the future of the church. He believes deeply in connectivity. None of us in Fresh Expressions world want Lone Ranger Christianity. So we want pioneers linked up with churches. We want teams, and the same is true with denominations. So we really want to catalyze Fresh Expressions of church from central operating systems. But in order for those things to be more missional in focus, we've really got to do some self-correction, I think, in terms of appreciating all of the institutionalism that has led us to this point, but getting very honest about what we're maintaining and what about our maintenance mode is keeping us from mission. And so I think, a question that Chris is asking is, what do we need to take with us and what do we need to leave behind to move into the future where denominations are about discipleship and transformation and church planting. As much as we love all of our institutional things, our funds and our conference centers and our, all of the things that have HVAC that breaks. What do we need to do in order to sort of really, again, take an accounting of what is effective and what we might need to kind of bless and celebrate and then leave behind.
Good stuff. Yeah, from this Wesleyan sister here. What's essential and what is not essential? As Wesley has been attributed to saying, but I don't think he actually said that. But
but it is. But it's also but it means celebrating our history. And I think we had an episode earlier with Todd Bolsinger, and Todd talks about let's honor the past. Let's be thankful for it, and sometimes our history can catalyze our future. It's just we just don't need to get stuck in it. It's a law and gospel conversation. It's the posture of our heart. If we're hanging on to things, is that law or is it really gospel? So I think some having that open posture, open hands, and that's what we need to see from denominational leaders moving forward. We need them. They have support for the church, but to the extent that they catalyze movement.
All right. Well, without further ado, have a listen in on this conversation with Dr. Christopher Backert.
Well, this is the Fresh Expressions podcast, and I'm joined today by Dr. Chris Backert, who's the director of Fresh Expressions in North America. And Chris, it's really good to have you on the podcast for a second time. It's a privilege.
Good to be here.
We're talking about a subject that's near and dear to your heart, which is denominations, which denominations are just sort of like, this human institution like we have to have. But there are certain things that I think you've pinpointed in your work and research over the years that point to a thriving denomination or components that make a thriving denomination. And so I'm just curious, kind of what your thoughts are in terms of what makes a thriving denomination.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think to back up just a little bit, why this is important to me is just a number of years ago, I had an observation that throughout, especially the last couple of 100 years, there's always been what I would call translocal covenanted church collaboration. And that, for the most part, in the last 150, 200 years, has manifested itself in the form of denominationalism. And that's important to think about it for me on like a bit of a higher level first, because there's not a lot of people that today want to talk about denominations or think that most denominations have any real relevance to the life of local congregations, or even more so to the lives of individual disciples or families within local churches. But when you step back and you realize that there's always been some kind of translocal covenanted church collaboration, and as those ways of relating to each other outside of just a local context have sort of morphed and shifted over the last 2,000 years, they always have still had an impact on local churches and on individual disciples or families within local churches. And so I think it's an important part of the future, just as much as it's important for us to be thinking about how we live out our faith in these days as individual followers of Jesus, or in our families, as important it is for us as church leaders of local congregations to consider what is the shape and focus and way of being for our ministries in our cities or towns. It's also important for us to think about how do we connect and relate to other Christians and other churches that are not just within a drivable distance from us. And it's an important part of the visible church in the world, is how churches connect and relate to one another. And today, there's been the emergence, and especially in the last 2 decades, of a lot of church networks. And that's the way people talk about the new things that have formed. But many of them take on similarities to denominations, and they are a new way of church collaboration that people are finding within their whole ecclesial life. So that's why it's important to me, because I don't think that churches connecting and relating to one another and finding ways of being in covenant to one another or being on mission together is going to go away, even if we are in an era where it appears that denominations are dying. I don't think they're so much dying as they are morphing into something new or newer.
Yeah, I think the morphing is a really important thing as we think about iterative leadership or adaptive leadership. I mean, how are you seeing the morph? I mean, you talked about translocal, so that's maybe a new kind of concept for people to get their mind around, but translocal being like a local church connection that is tethered to something bigger than itself, networked even across the country, even across geographic boundaries. Even that's what a network really is. So talk a little bit about the morphing.
Yeah, well, the thing that I believe is important is to most people to understand that even the denominations that we have today really have gone through various seasons in their lives over the last 150, 100, 200 years. And the way that they look today is not the way that they looked in 1900 or 1850. So, for instance, let's just take the Baptist as a subset of Protestant Christians, right? Now, most Baptists would say they're not a denomination, and they would say they're associations of churches, but most people understand Baptists to be a denomination. Well, in the, prior to the Civil War, there was basically one Baptist group in the country, and they primarily functioned translocally together for the appointment and serving of missionaries. And that was basically the whole reason for being of the Baptist denominational body. And then smaller groups of Baptists in cities or states or regions, they did the same thing. They got together to raise money and support and send missionaries to their regions or their cities. And so today, though, if you were to look at any Baptist denomination, whether it's an American Baptist, used to be Northern Baptist Convention, or Southern Baptist, or any of the Progressive National Baptists or the National Baptist Convention, any Baptist group, you would look at them today and say, they don't look like an organization that primarily exists to raise money to send missionaries. And so in every, and you could take that same concept and apply it to Methodism or Presbyterianism, and you just realize that the way that they function for 50 years or 100 years is not the way that they function today. That what we have today in most denominational life is really the output of the organizational era in North America. Somewhere between the end of the First World War and the 1960s, the majority of denominations in our country of all kinds across the theological spectrum are largely shaped by what happened during that period of time. And they have largely carried on the same basic structure with some minor tweaks over the last 4 decades that developed during an era of consolidation and corporate understanding of church between, again, the end of the First World War and somewhere around the 1960s. And so that was another phase in denominational life. We look very different than the previous phase. And I think what we are now is there's another morphing going on, which is pushing the future toward more of a network approach to denominational life. But where the real challenge comes into place is that many of the structures that were set up in the organizational age of denominational life are really hard to dismantle, to move into a new sort of phase of denominations sort of functioning and their being together. And so that's a lot of the challenge that all of our historic denominational bodies are facing today, and some doing better with making those changes, and some it's a greater struggle.
And so kind of forecast out for us a little bit in terms of where you think those, how are those structures become more nimble? What's the future look like?
Yeah, I think it's really hard for denominations that are bounded by geography. And that's the primary, I think, barrier to most transformation that needs to take place within a denominational family. And what I mean by bounded by geography is that within North American context, because there are several bodies in North America that are both U.S. and Canada, several denominations in North America that cover both countries, and of course many that are just in the States or just in Canada. I think the challenge is that if you are one of those groups and then you're split up into smaller regional groups, so let's say you are the West Virginia Synod of the Lutheran Church, you don't have jurisdiction to do things in Michigan, for instance. And I think that the real challenge is in our networked society that people, while they still care about what happens locally, often find greater affinity or a sharing of a common passion for mission in some other part of the country. And when you're fixed in a geographic boundary, it's very hard to change, because you're left in a situation where you're really not able to expand your reach except within your own state or your own region. And I think it's a challenge if you're in that phase. So I think that the denominational bodies that have been able to either break down the geographic boundaries and let churches connect outside of their particular location or in addition to their particular location, they have had a lot more success in finding ways of transforming their system. And I think the other thing that's a challenge is that almost all denominational bodies have kind of historic artifacts that they carry with them from decade to decade. Something that was really awesome in the 1970s that they're still paying for in a lot of sense financially here in 2022. And those artifacts really weigh down the denominational system's ability to change or its ability to invest in what is needed now. So you look at a lot of the groups over the last, let's just say 10 or 20 years that are more thriving as denominational bodies or connectional bodies. Lots of them have really minimized the number of sort of historic artifacts or institutions that they carry with them year after year. And they have put their focus on a very few things. So church planting typically is one of their focuses, or multiplication, strengthening or revitalization of existing churches, and leadership development, and maybe sometimes a global mission arm. But a lot of the denominations that are doing better in the last 2 decades, they're focused on just a few things. And the historic bodies still have colleges or schools or children's homes or historic societies, all kinds of institutions that grew up during the organizational age of denominational life that they're still carrying. And those things feel very important to the people who come to the meetings to vote on whether or not they should have a future. But often they're really way down the bodies, the system's capacity to change. So I think in the future, the denominations that are able to sort of break down their institutionalism in some form and to lessen it will have a greater shot at thriving and at surviving and thriving. And those that don't, it's going to be difficult because it's just unless they have a big endowment of some kind, they are just going to get kind of like stuck in the, as Jim Collins would say in Good to Great, in the doom loop, where they keep investing in things that used to work, and they're losing out on investing in the future. So I see a day in which some denominations will just have a long, slow decline until they reach a tipping point. And depending on who you talk to and what denomination you're talking about, that tipping point, they may already have passed, or it could be coming soon, in which there'll be precipitous decline. Some denominations will make the transition to a less institutional, more networked approach. And then I think the third thing that will happen is a lot of the networks that have formed in the last 2 decades will start to look more denominational. They'll start to add layers of structure. They'll start to have increased services or things that they offer to the churches that are part of them. And some of these things are already taking place. And so I think those are the 3 broad buckets of what I see happening in the general denominational life. I think there'll be consolidations. I wouldn't be surprised. A lot of other people have said this, that if there is some kind of United Church of the United States, like there is a United Church of Canada, at some point in time, the next 15 to 20 years. I think there'll be some other kinds of consolidation from other denominational bodies, especially ones that are really small. You know, there's just a load of groups who most people have never heard of, who have 150 or 200 churches across the whole country. And I think that there will be some way that they have to consolidate to continue to survive and be relevant to their congregations. So I think you're going to see a number of different things happening over the next 2 decades, but those are some of them.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about maybe success stories, or denominations you've seen that have adapted without. It's kind of like not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but kind of how do you see, or maybe some stories of denominations that are maybe successfully navigating this cultural moment?
Yeah, well, I'll just pick two or three that are in somewhat distinct situations. So, for instance, the Converge Worldwide is what they're called now, but they used to be called the Baptist General Conference. They were primarily a historic Baptist body that kind of came out of Europe, and most of their folks migrated to the upper Midwest. All right. So they were the Baptist version of the Lutherans. And they were a denomination that was very small for a long period of time. And maybe I think 600-700 churches in the early 2000s across the whole country. And they made a couple key decisions, but one of them was they changed their name because they realized that in the era that is coming, that people would want to be connected to something that didn't have a denominational tag. And so they made that change. And then the second kind of really key decision that they made is they decided that they were going to have a really strong emphasis on church planting and church multiplication. A third decision that they made was they were going to put effort into church recruitment of non-denominational congregations or independent churches who were looking for some level of connection and affiliation. And then the fourth thing that I would say from an outside perspective, I believe that they did is they determined that the future of the people of the United States was a lot more colorful than their predominantly like 99% upper Midwest Anglo population that was made up their churches. And so they put a really concerted effort into diversifying culturally their denominational body, thinking that was really important for their future. So today, you fast forward 15 or 20 years in the transformation of the Baptist General Conference into Converge. And my understanding is that they probably have about 2,000 or so churches that have joined or been started as a part of their fellowship in the last 15 or 20 years. That's pretty tremendous growth from a denominational perspective. I understand that about 25 to 30% of all of their congregations are non-Anglo. That's pretty substantial transformation from a denomination that for its almost entire history was almost completely Anglo. They've had a great number of churches join that were independent, join their denomination. And they focus on just a very few things. And mostly they're the things I've already mentioned that they thought were keys to their transformation. That's what they continue to focus on today. Even something like, most denominations have a pension fund or some structure like that within their body. Well, they, I think a year or two ago, divested themselves of that type of ministry. And their pastors now are all, I think, get those services through the Wesleyan denomination and not through their own Baptist General Conference or Converge Worldwide. So that's kind of a national example, I think, of a group that, again, a free church tradition. So some of those changes were easier to make because they didn't have the layers of approval that would need to happen in some more hierarchical bodies. But that's a good example of a transformation in our current time.
You've talked about the artifact of the pension fund that they had to leave behind. Are there any other artifacts you can think of that they had to leave behind in order to move forward?
Yeah, some of my knowledge about the particulars of their situation is not as extensive, but I do believe that like a lot of groups, they had some camps and conferences that different groups around the country would support, and I think they, like many others, have kept some and divested themselves of others. So a lot of those smaller bodies like them, they had a proportionate amount of those things that were part of their history. And I think that the bigger you are, the more of those that you carry with you into the future. And again, it's harder to loosen some of those, but those were important things that were a manifestation of denominational life, in the mid 1900s that may not be as important today.
Sure. And in their case, being kind of a free church group, they were able to go after churches that were not affiliated. And that's sort of how they grew. I think a lot of people are going to be intrigued by the growth of multi-ethnic congregations, but you would say most of those were formerly not affiliated with a particular group?
My understanding from the conversations I've had with their leaders is that it's probably a strong mix of planting new churches as well as recruitment of independent congregations to join into their fellowship. But I think this is not just possible for a free church tradition. You think the Wesleyan Church, since I just mentioned them, is another good example of what was really a small and not very thriving denominational body 2 decades ago, that before COVID would have been the one of the year over year most growing denominational groups in the country. And of course, everyone has had a significant backstep with COVID. So that they did, if you look at them, a lot of similar things. They focused on church renewal, leadership development, church planting, and of course they have a global arm. And so it's a more hierarchical example of a group that moved in the same direction. And again, now one of the commonalities of those is that they were all sort of smaller from a national perspective. Often they would be smaller in size than some regional denominational bodies of the big historic denominational identities: Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, etc.
So then in a denomination like the Wesleyan Church, they have bishops or heads?
They have district superintendents, which function like bishops.
And are those now non-geographical? Do you know?
My understanding is the Wesleyan Church is largely geographical.
Okay.
Still, but of course they cover the whole country, and so that is helpful to them. But they have really focused on a few smaller areas, the same ones I mentioned just a few minutes ago. So I think that shows. I believe that they used to have a kind of a women's auxiliary organization, like many denominational bodies have had. I don't think that they have that, or it's very small compared to what it used to be anymore, is an example of something that they maybe divested along the way to focus on the future. So it's just another example of a group that took similar steps within their own more hierarchical structures.
So you are the leader of the Fresh Expressions movement. This is the Fresh Expressions podcast, and Fresh Expressions works with denominations of all shapes and sizes. We also work with new churches. Some of the new churches are independent. What are the implications of denominations today in terms of how we do church in the future? Do you see a day where you're going to see a lot more kind of cross-network collaboration? Are you going to see, again, the continued morphing? What do you think the implications are for how we do church, even if particularly from a Fresh Expressions sort of orientation?
I think a lot of groups, a lot of local churches and pastors still look to their denominational bodies, if they are part of one, for some guidance on the shape of ministry in our current context. So one of the things that I think is really relevant for all denominational leaders is to help paint a picture for what the future of the local church looks like and a path to get there. And I think that's one of the best ways that denominational leaders can be vital to the local churches that they serve is by doing those things, by painting a picture and by showing them the path to get to that picture. So I think that it's very possible that if denominational leaders take that seriously, that they can be sort of prime change agents for local churches through local church leadership to have a more thriving ministry in 5 years from now than the local church does now. And for that to really perhaps even look different than one might expect. So one example of something like that is from a small Pentecostal denomination that one of their district officers, a denominational leader for one of their regions, also is a bivocational pastor for one of their local churches, a small church that had 12 people in it. And they were familiar and had been involved in some of the Fresh Expressions ministry of the last couple of years, and were familiar with a number of the different things that we support or advocate. And they made the decision that after trying everything that most people try to revitalize their local churches, that they just kind of needed to start over with a blank ecclesial slate and determine what was the best way for them to bear witness to the gospel within their community. And they decided they were going to stop being a normal Sunday morning congregation, and they were going to pivot to being a dinner church that meets on Friday nights. And so after, many decades of history, they made that decision. And now a year later, they are a very different looking church, but they have 7 or 8 times as many people involved in their congregation. They're reaching new people. Their grandkids are coming back into the life of the church. They have a more vital ministry in their city. And so now, the denominational leader hopes to use their own story and example to say to other churches within their group, here, this is possible for you too. And it might look totally different than you making your version of church better than it is now, but it is a vital way forward for the future. And so denominational leaders can do that kind of thing because they work with large groups of churches, sometimes over vast geographic territories. And so many churches today, I believe, are really looking for help in knowing how to really be vital in the days ahead. And it's such a challenging thing for them to figure out by themselves. And I think it's one way for denominational leaders to help. So if denominational leaders do that, I think that in 5 to 10 years' time, they'll find a much more thriving body that they're serving and leading around them. So that's one of the things that I think is really relevant, because denominational leaders can affect change to multiple congregations all at once. And of course, we all know every local church in some form makes its own decisions, and some will opt into that and some will not. But denominational leaders can be agents of change for local congregations. That's one thing I think we could see and why it matters.
And I think that leads into just kind of hope for the future. I mean, what I'm excited about, in terms of the future, is seeing all those engaged in the work of ministry at whatever level to have their hands in the soil of the local church. And I think, some of these more networked realities give us the ability to do that. They're leaner, they're more lightweight, but it seems to be where so many things in society are going. So any other sort of thoughts about hope for the future, hope that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think a lot of my hope comes from in our specific sort of area of ministry. I think that really anchoring on that denominational leaders can be agents of change, agents of change for local churches, agents of change for the life of the gospel in all kinds of cities and towns all across North America. And I think if they see themselves that way, and the denominational bodies see themselves that way, then they will affect and be an agent of change for their own system if they decide to do that. And I think the second thing that gives me hope is I think that if there's a recognition of helping our denominational families really return to seeing themselves as catalyzers of a mission movement, then I think that more people will be involved with them. I think that there's a great number of non-denominational or independent churches across the country of all kinds that I think in a lot of ways the era of independence is fading. I don't think most independent churches or non-denominational churches are going to want to jump into a highly structured denominational body, but I think they are looking for connectivity and fellowship and shared mission beyond just themselves. And so I think there's an opportunity for that in the future and for them to be part of the remaking of denominations in North America. And I think as a whole, it could really translate into seeing more people reached and discipled and following Jesus if denominational leaders see themselves in that mold.
So really this comes down to the joy of following Jesus, who calls the church his body, and there's one body in many parts, and the connectivity across the body, even though it might look different from, say, a past of purely regional identification. Maybe there's identification with, like you said, Chris, a camp or a conference center or a university or a program that's been around for a long time. By focusing the values of the denomination, by really making a few key priorities the point, and one of those things really is mission advancement, church planting, those kinds of initiatives. We'll see, I think, denominations revitalize, just like we're seeing congregations do the same. So I think a lot of the things that we're testing out with a local church in terms of a local church creating fresh expressions of church, you'll see in a denomination where the leadership are interested in activating real change that is adaptive and iterative and nimble, and that's the future, and the future is now. So thanks for being here, and thanks for always for your really brilliant leadership, often behind the scenes. But we are so thankful when you do come on the podcast and share a little bit more about what's going on and what makes you tick.
Fresh Expressions is a worldwide movement of everyday missionaries who want to see churches thrive in the places we eat, play, work, and yes, even in our traditional churches. To learn a simple 5-phase process for starting a new expression of church, go to freshexpressionsus.org/how-to-start. The Fresh Expressions podcast is hosted by Gannon Sims and me, Heather Jalad. It's edited by Joel Limbaum and produced by Kathleen Blackie and Chris Morton. Our national director is Dr. Christopher Backert. If you've learned something or been encouraged by this podcast, please help us spread the word. You can give us a review on Apple Music or Spotify and share this episode on social media. Now, may God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine on us so that God's ways may be known on earth, your salvation among all nations.